The moment I saw that porch light burning at midnight, I already knew something was wrong. My mother hadn't left an outside light on after 9 o'clock in 22 years. That's not an exaggeration. That's just who Margaret Voss was, practical to her bones, careful with electricity, careful with money, careful with everything except the man she married after my father died. I was standing in the rain behind her house in Franklin, Tennessee, with a spare key pressed so hard into my palm it left teeth marks in my skin. My truck was parked 2 streets over. Old habit. I'd been awake for 6 minutes when her text came through. 3 words. A code we'd set up when I was 12 and haven't used once since. No explanation. Just a location pin. Just those 3 words. And I drove 40 minutes without breathing properly the entire way. I want you to understand something before I go any further. 24 years in Army intelligence doesn't make you fearless. It makes you quiet. Real fear in a trained person doesn't explode outward. It drops your temperature about 3 degrees and makes every detail feel suddenly important, the way the rain was hitting the gutters wrong, the light leaking under the back door, the faint sound of a television playing inside. No yelling. No broken glass. Just television and rain and that one porch light burning. I remember thinking that the quiet scared me more than noise would have. I unlocked the back door slowly, stepped into the kitchen. The smell reached me first. Burnt coffee and bourbon. Then I saw the mug, broken near the sink. Then my mother's purse on the floor. Then a paper towel beside the counter with lipstick smeared across it. Not fresh. Recently wiped. I heard Frank before I saw him. Maggie. His voice from the living room, thick and mean with whiskey. Who's in the kitchen? I stepped around the corner. Frank Aldridge was sitting in his recliner like he owned the air in the room. Bourbon glass balanced on his stomach. Some ball game muted on screen. Gray hair too carefully combed for a man who'd been drinking since at least 6. He had that particular look of aging men who've mistaken social confidence for intelligence. Good watch he couldn't afford anymore. Polo shirt. That expression people wear when they've been the loudest person in every room for 30 years and see no reason to change. He looked at me and said, "Well, look who showed up to save the day." I didn't answer him. I looked for my mother. She was standing near the hallway with one hand pulling her cardigan closed at the collar. Even from across the room I could see the split along her lower lip. She had tried to cover it with pale pink lipstick. She hadn't quite managed it. Something inside me went absolutely cold. Not angry. Cold. That's the part people who haven't worked in high-pressure environments don't fully understand. Genuine anger in trained people often arrives as stillness first. "Mom," I said quietly, "are you okay?" Frank answered before she could open her mouth. She dropped a mug and cut herself cleaning it up. "Everything's fine. You can head back to Nashville." My mother tried to smile at me. That almost hurt worse than the cut itself. She said, "I'm all right, honey." She was not all right. I knew her tells, the tight shoulders, the careful way she was watching Frank's face instead of mine, the way she stood slightly sideways like she was trying to make herself smaller. I had seen those tells when I was 9 years old, after my father died and bill collectors used to call the house on Tuesday mornings. She always stood like that when she was afraid of making someone angrier. Frank leaned forward in the recliner. "You can't just walk into people's homes in the middle of the night, Rachel Cara. Whatever. It's not appropriate." I looked at him. My mother sent me an emergency code. His face shifted. Just for a second. Then he laughed. "Jesus. You people make everything into a movie." I kept my voice at the same temperature. "Mom, do you want me here?" Frank immediately said, "She's tired and you're being dramatic." But my mother nodded. Small movement. Almost invisible. Still enough. Frank stood up too fast. Bourbon sloshed across the carpet. He came toward me with that particular swagger of a man who has spent years discovering that raising his voice works. And I will be honest with you, in that moment, I was not a retired lieutenant colonel. I was just somebody's daughter standing in a kitchen at midnight, watching a drunk man move toward her mother. "This is my house," Frank said. "And you are going to leave it." He grabbed my wrist. "Wrong decision. Training is a strange thing. It lives in the body, not the brain." My brain was still processing the situation when my body had already turned, rotated his arm inward, and placed him against the kitchen wall with just enough pressure to stop movement. It took less than 2 seconds. I did not hurt him. I made a point of not hurting him. I just stopped him. The bourbon glass hit the floor somewhere behind us. Frank made a sound I had never heard from him before, startled, small, humiliated. I released him immediately and stepped back. "Don't touch me again." My mother stared at me like she was seeing someone she had never met. Frank rubbed his shoulder and muttered something I won't repeat. Then my mother disappeared down the hallway. Silently. Just gone. And I watched Frank's face in the second that followed, watched the exact moment he understood that control was slipping, and, honestly, I felt nothing close to satisfaction. Just tired. Just this deep, specific exhaustion of recognizing a pattern you have seen before, in very different rooms, in very different parts of the world. Honestly, if that had been me in my 20s, I would have grabbed her overnight bag and physically put her in my truck. I would have thought that was protecting her. I know better now. Protection and autonomy are not the same thing. Forcing someone out of a dangerous situation before they are ready doesn't heal them. It just moves them geographically while leaving everything unresolved inside. My mother came back a few minutes later with a blue canvas bag I recognized from family trips we used to take to Center Hill Lake when I was a kid. Frank looked at that bag like it had personally betrayed him. He said, "She'll be back tomorrow. She always comes back." My mother looked at him for a long moment. And then, quietly and completely clearly, she said, "No, I don't think I will." I need to stop right there for a second and tell you what that sentence did to me. Because I have sat through military briefings, and budget hearings, and deposition interviews without blinking. But those 6 words from my 63-year-old mother in a kitchen in Franklin, Tennessee, nearly broke my composure completely. Not because they were dramatic, because they weren't. She said it the way someone says something they have needed to say for years and are finally too tired not to say. "We didn't leave that night." I know that's the first thing people ask. Why didn't you just take her and go? And I want to explain this carefully, because I think people who have never stood in that situation genuinely don't understand it. My mother stopped in the doorway. The rain was blowing across the back porch and her slippers were getting wet, and she held the door frame and she said, "Kara, I can't just leave." Frank heard it, and he smiled, just barely, and I understood immediately that he had been counting on that exact sentence for a very long time. Shame is a better cage than any lock, so we stayed. I told Frank I was sleeping in the guest room, and when he started to object, I reminded him that my mother's name was on the deed. I said it once, evenly, and he went and sat back down in his recliner. I sat with my mother at the kitchen table while I cleaned the cut on her lip with a cotton pad from the first aid kit under the sink. She kept apologizing for the mess. That's how I knew how bad it had gotten. A woman who has just been hurt should not be the one apologizing for the broken ceramic. I wanted to ask everything at once. I had 100 questions. But interrogation and care are not the same thing, and I had learned that lesson in rooms very different from a suburban kitchen in Tennessee. So I asked only one. "Do you feel safe sleeping here tonight if I'm in the house?" Her eyes moved toward the living room, then back to me. "Yes," she said. I slept in the guest room with my boots on and the light off, listening to the house breathe. Every home has a sound at 1 a.m. That house used to have a good sound. The old clock in the hallway, the ice maker, the neighbor's dog. That night it had a different sound. At 1:22 inches the morning, Frank stopped outside the guest room door. I know because the floorboard creaked. He stood there maybe 8 seconds. Then he walked away. That told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he was when no one was performing for him. Morning arrived and Frank came into the kitchen dressed in clean clothes like Saturday night. Was a weather system that had passed. He announced his shoulder hurt. I told him that was strange, since I was under the impression I'd just been a government desk worker for 24 years. My mother looked down at her toast to hide something that wasn't quite a smile. Frank didn't find it funny. He called it assault. I reminded him I had released him immediately after he grabbed me first. He grabbed his truck keys and left for breakfast. The door rattled the window when it closed. My mother sat at the table and cried without making a single sound. That kind of crying, silent, practiced, is one of the most heartbreaking things I have ever witnessed. It means someone has learned they are not allowed to take up space with their own grief. It means they have done it quietly for so long that quiet became the only way they knew how. I sat beside her. I said, "Mom, has this happened before?" She nodded once without looking up. "How many times?" "I don't know anymore." I had to look somewhere else for a second. At the church calendar on the wall. At the photograph of me in uniform that Frank had moved behind a pile of grocery coupons. "When did it start?" I asked. She told me about the bank account first. How Frank had started helping with bills after he retired. How helping became managing. How managing became controlling. How she had stopped being able to spend $20 without explaining herself. How he read her messages and told their neighbors she was getting forgetful. How he said if she ever tried to leave, he'd make sure everyone knew she couldn't manage alone. "That's not anger," she whispered. "That's the plan." She was right. That's exactly what it was. Not one bad night. A system, built slowly, piece by piece. The way you don't notice a room getting darker until you can't see the door anymore. I need you to sit with that for a moment, because I think about this a lot, the way we talk about abuse like it has a beginning and an end. Like there's a clear moment when normal friction becomes something worse, but the people living inside it can't see the line. It moves on them. A little embarrassment here, a little financial dependency there, a moment of fear followed by a week of normal, and one day they look up, and they don't recognize themselves. If you have ever been in a relationship, any kind of relationship where you started editing yourself to avoid someone else's reaction, you know at least a small version of what I mean. The difference is only degree. I made 3 phone calls from the back porch that afternoon while Frank was out. The first was to Patricia Dunmore, an elder law attorney in Nashville, former prosecutor, the kind of voice that makes a room quieter when she enters it. The second was to Marcus Webb, an old Army contact who now worked financial compliance for a regional bank in Memphis. The third call took longest. Adult Protective Services. I sat in a lawn chair while the last of the summer cicadas screamed in the tree line and explained my mother's situation to a woman named Donna who asked careful, practical questions and listened without filling the silence with reassurance. That evening Marcus texted me 3 words. "Call me tonight. Urgent." I stepped out to the back porch after my mother went to bed. Frank was asleep in the recliner. Marcus picked up on the first ring. He said, "Kara, your stepfather's name turned up connected to 2 elder fraud complaints in Williamson County. Financial manipulation, loan coercion, both involving widows." I stared out at the dark yard for a moment. My pulse slowed. That cold feeling again? Was my mother one of them? Not in the formal complaints, but she might be. I looked back through the kitchen window at Frank, asleep in the blue television light, looking like every harmless retired man in every quiet suburb in America. He thought this was still a family argument. It wasn't anymore. The family gathering 2 weeks in was Frank's idea. His style when private tension got too thick, he dragged everyone into public where he could play the charming husband again. He needed an audience the same way some people need oxygen. We drove out to my cousin Beth's place in a newer development east of Franklin Big Backyard. String lights, kids chasing each other across a lawn that smelled like fresh-cut grass. I almost didn't go. Investigations are mostly patience and paperwork, and the particular exhaustion of watching someone dangerous keep smiling at people who don't know what you know. But my mother wanted to go, she said quietly. "I don't want people asking questions." And that sentence bothered me more than she knew, because it meant she'd spent years organizing her life around managing other people's comfort instead of her own safety. Frank arrived, carrying a peach cobbler like a man running for county office. He kissed my mother's cheek in front of everyone, touched her back constantly, said, "Look at this family. This is what matters." Everybody laughed politely. Later, he found me near the drinks table and aimed his commentary at the room the way a person does when they want everyone to hear but no one to respond. He said I'd been through a lot in the military. Said certain environments leave marks on people. Said he just worried about me sometimes. Said it all with warmth, with concern, with every performance tool he had. He was planting seeds, making me sound unstable before anything became public. I had briefed military commanders on this exact manipulation strategy. It looked cleaner in a PowerPoint. Watching it aimed at me across a backyard in Tennessee, I will be honest, it made my jaw tight. My mother went still beside me. She recognized what he was doing, and that tiny recognition in her face meant she had been watching him do it for years. I finally looked up at him. "Frank, you should probably stop talking now." His smile tightened. Later, in the garage, he followed me in and let the pretense drop entirely. He said no one in that family would believe me over him. He said my mother would fall apart without him inside a month. He said I should have stayed gone. I stepped slightly closer, not threatening, just enough that he had to look up instead of down, and I told him he should really stop talking when he thought he was winning. Something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. For the first time, maybe, a man named Raymond Briggs found me near the fence after dinner. Raymond was a quiet, older man with tired eyes and nicotine-stained fingers who I knew from Frank's poker group. He pulled me aside and kept his voice low. He said Frank had been talking to people about investment opportunities, His sister had gotten involved. He paused. She lost nearly $40,000. There it was. Another piece. Would she talk to an attorney? I asked. Raymond looked over at Frank holding court near the grill. If it keeps him from doing it to someone else, he said quietly. Yeah, I think she would. That night, driving back to Franklin, I understood something clearly. Frank thought this was still a private family problem. He had no idea how many walls had already been built around him. The Friday everything changed, started quietly, the way the worst days always do. I helped my mother load 2 bags into my truck that afternoon, while Frank was out buying beer for poker night. She kept looking over her shoulder. She said she felt guilty. I leaned against the tailgate and told her that was normal. She said she should have done this years ago. Her voice broke just slightly on the word years. I told her the most important thing she did was send the code. Her eyes filled. I was so embarrassed, she whispered. I looked at her for a moment. You don't need to be. A breeze moved through the pine trees. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower ran its last pass of the day. Ordinary sounds. I have thought about that often since how life keeps sounding normal, even while someone's entire world is coming apart. The neighborhood didn't pause. The trees didn't notice. I drove her to her friend Sharon's condo in Brentwood. She carried 2 bags and her medications. 40 years of adult life reduced to overnight luggage. I sat in Sharon's driveway for a moment after my mother went inside. Then I drove back to Frank's house. His poker group was already there when I arrived. Raymond sitting at the card table with a beer, looking at his cards too carefully. 2 other men arguing about college football. Cigar smoke drifting through the cracked back window. Frank at the kitchen island, pouring bourbon, laughing too loud. He looked up when I came in. Well, he said to the room. Look who came to supervise. I closed the door behind me. Mom's staying with Sharon tonight. He blinked, recovered fast. Good for her. But I saw at the flash of something behind his eyes. Control. Slipping. One of the men at the table frowned. Everything okay with Margaret? Frank waved his hand. She gets emotional sometimes. Her daughter makes it worse. I pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. She doesn't get emotional, I said. She gets afraid. The room quieted. Frank laughed once, high and thin. Oh, Jesus, are we doing this at poker night? Nobody joined the laugh. That was interesting. Frank poured more bourbon, he said, and I want you to really hear this, he said. You spend enough years married to someone, you learn how to manage people. He said it to the room like it was normal, like it was wisdom. Raymond slowly looked up from his cards. Frank didn't hear himself. He kept going. Property taxes don't pay themselves. She signed everything I put in front of her. That's how a partnership works. One of the other men shifted in his chair. I leaned back slightly. What about the cabin? Frank's eyes snapped to me. What cabin? Center Hill Lake. My father bought that property in 1991. She never signed a transfer. Silence. Real silence. Even the muted television in the other room felt too loud. Property maintenance is expensive, Frank said. Raymond set his cards face down. You told me she inherited that property outright. She did. No, I said quietly. She didn't. Frank's jaw tightened. He pointed at me. You are accusing me of something and I want a lawyer before. Headlights crossed the front windows. Then another set. Then a third. Frank turned toward the window. His face changed. A knock at the door. Firm. Professional. He looked at me. Slowly. What did you do? I stood up. I didn't do anything, Frank. You did this yourself. Second knock. Williamson County Sheriff's Office. We need to speak with a Frank Aldridge. One of the poker players said something under his breath. Another reached quietly for his jacket. Frank moved toward the door fast. I stepped sideways into his path, not blocking, just there. His face went red. He said, You set me up. You set yourself up, I said. I just paid attention. I opened the door. 2 sheriff's deputies stood outside beside a woman from Adult Protective Services holding a folder thick with paperwork. Rain had started again, soft and steady behind them. One deputy looked past me into the room, then looked back at me. Something registered in his face. Ma'am, he said carefully. Lieutenant Colonel Voss? I nodded once. Frank froze. The deputy straightened slightly without thinking about it. I didn't realize you were involved in this. And I watched Frank in that moment, watched him look between me and the deputy and begin to understand, perhaps for the first time, how completely he had misjudged the situation. He had looked at a quiet, calm woman and seen submission. He had looked at composure and seen weakness. He had mistaken every tool I had for evidence that I had none. That was his mistake. Not the only one, but the last one. Raymond Briggs stood up slowly from the poker table. "My sister filed her statement yesterday," he said. Frank stared at him. He started to say something ugly. Raymond didn't flinch. He just said, quietly, "You stole from a widow, Frank." The deputy turned toward Frank. "Sir, we need to ask you questions regarding financial exploitation complaints and a reported pattern of intimidation connected." Frank laughed. It was a terrible sound, desperate and thin. He pointed at me wildly and said, "She's lying. All of this is her. She's been turning Maggie against me from the beginning." Nobody answered him. Outside, across the dark, wet yard, my mother stood near the driveway under an umbrella beside Sharon. Frank saw her. He said, "Elaine, Maggie, come on, come inside." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and slowly removed her wedding ring. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly, the way you set down something you've been carrying for too long. "I'm done being afraid in my own home," she said. Frank opened his mouth. Nothing came out. And that silence, that specific, complete silence, was worth more to me than anything else I witnessed that entire year. People think the hard part ends when someone finally leaves. It doesn't. That's just the moment reality starts. 4 months after that Friday night, my mother moved into a small townhouse outside Nashville, beige siding. A little front porch with wind chimes that rang every time a breeze came through. Quiet neighborhood, quiet life. The first time I visited, I noticed she looked rested in a way I hadn't seen in years. She had started a watercolor class. She was buying flowers for the porch. She was drinking her coffee slowly, without rushing, without that tightened posture of someone waiting for criticism to arrive with the next sip. Trauma doesn't evaporate when someone leaves a bad situation. I want to be honest about that. But there is a difference between carrying weight and being crushed by it. My mother was carrying again, instead of being crushed. That difference is everything. The legal process with Frank was slow, unglamorous, and expensive. Real justice always moves slower than people expect. He was eventually charged with financial fraud connected to forged property documents and exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and 2 women outside our family testified who nobody had known about before the investigation. That made me physically sick for a while. Not because it surprised me, but because predators almost never start with their worst victim. My mother had not been his first practice run. The cabin near Center Hill Lake stayed in our family after the forged transfer was blocked. Patricia Dunmore called my mother on a Thursday morning with the news, and my mother stood at her kitchen window and cried quietly for about 3 minutes. Then she called me and said simply, "We should go up there." We drove up on a Saturday in October, when the trees around the lake had gone gold and rust red and the air smelled like wood smoke and damp pine. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered from childhood. Funny how memory stretches the dimensions of places. Inside, it still smelled faintly like coffee grounds and old wood, and the fishing tackle my father used to keep under the sink. We spent the afternoon cleaning and opening windows, and found photo albums in a plastic bin that neither of us had seen in 20 years. Late that afternoon, we sat on the dock, wrapped in old blankets, while the sun went down over the water. My mother said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. She said that after my father died, when I was young, she had always worried I grew up too fast, too serious, too watchful. She said she thought she'd been protecting me by keeping peace in the house, any house, every house after that, by teaching me that calm was the only acceptable response to difficulty. I said, "I know, Mom." She shook her head. "No, you don't." That surprised me enough that I looked over. Her eyes were full. She kept going anyway. She said she should have left sooner. She said she kept making excuses for Frank until she forgot she was making excuses. She said she was sorry not for herself, but for what I had walked into at midnight. For the weight of it. I put my arm around her shoulders and I said, "The bravest thing you did wasn't leaving." She looked at me. It was sending the code, asking for help at all. She cried then. Real crying, audible, present, not the silent practiced kind from the kitchen table. The kind that means someone finally feels safe enough to take up space with their own grief. The lake knocked softly against the dock beneath us. The wind chimes from the old porch made their small sound. And honestly, in 24 years of work that took me to places I still can't name out loud, that hour on the dock with my mother meant more to me than any mission I ever briefed or completed. Revenge doesn't heal much. I used to think it did. But watching Frank lose his composure in front of his poker friends, watching the deputies walk him through his own front door, that felt like punctuation, not resolution. Freedom is the resolution. My mother sleeping through the night is the resolution. Her sitting on a porch with wind chimes, reading a mystery novel with her feet up, not apologizing for being tired, that's the resolution. Dennis Frank thought composure meant weakness, thought kindness was leverage, thought my mother's endurance was loyalty. By the time he understood the difference between those things, she was already gone, and everything he'd built around her was already collapsing. This story taught me that control almost never announces itself loudly. It comes in small favors and quiet criticisms and a gradual narrowing of what you're allowed to need. If you are watching someone you love endure something they insist is fine, trust what you observe over what they tell you. They may not be lying. They may just have stopped being able to see the cage because they have been inside it long enough. The specific thing I'd ask you to do today is this. If there is someone in your life you have been slightly worried about, not dramatically, not obviously, just someone who seems smaller than they used to be, more apologetic, more careful around a particular person, reach out to them, not with a confrontation, just with presence. Sometimes people don't need rescuing. They just need someone to still be there when they finally decide. And the question I'd leave you with is this. What have you been enduring quietly that you have started calling normal? If this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a 1-inch the comments if you think I made the right call staying that first night instead of forcing her to leave. Drop a 2 if you would have gotten her in the truck and driven away immediately. Drop a 3 if you've ever stood in a version of that kitchen yourself watching someone you love. Minimize something real. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. These stories remind me every single time that the situations inside them are not unique, they are just usually private. And sometimes the most useful thing in the world is knowing you're not the only one. If you're new here, subscribe. I tell real stories about the moments that change people quietly, completely, and usually without enough witnesses. You won't want to miss the next one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Franklin, Tennessee to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, living or deceased, or to actual events is entirely coincidental.